Jakub Grygiel is a professor of politics at Catholic University of America. He's a senior advisor at the Marathon Initiative and a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. In 2017 to 2018, he was a senior advisor in the Office of Policy Planning at the Department of State. Previously, he was the George H.W. Bush Associate Professor at SAIS-Johns Hopkins University. He is the author of several books: Classics in Strategy, Return of the Barbarians, Great Powers and Geopolitical Change, and co-author with Wes Mitchell of The Unquiet Frontier. His writings have appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The American Interest, Security Studies, Journal of Strategic Studies, National Interest, Claremont Review of Books, and so on. He earned a PhD from Princeton University. It's a great pleasure to have him again at the Mackinder Forum. His talk today will be 5 Rules to Manage the Frontier. We will record the talk, and Chatham House rules apply to Q&A. So thank you for attending. Jakub, take it away, please.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you all for coming. It's great to be back. What I thought I'll do is, I think I sent you the article, but I'll just summarize it briefly, and then we can have a conversation about it. The article, it's actually a co-authored article with my friend Wes Mitchell, with whom I have co-authored the book that Len mentioned, The Unquiet Frontier. And this is something that, you know, obviously we've been talking, the subject of the book and the subject of the article is something that we're constantly talking about it. And a couple of months ago, we decided to sit down quickly and see where we are on this unquiet frontier, according to sort of the logic and the argument that we presented in the book. At that time, and this was, I mean, time flies, but this was what, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, actually, that the book came out, The Unquiet Frontier. The way we looked at it is that, you know, American power obviously reaches on the Eurasian continent, and it has these frontline regions and frontline allies from, you know, Poland, Israel, Taiwan in Asia, and they were becoming tempting targets, objectives for our rivals, which we as a country often did not call rivals, by the way. They were often referred as potential partners, if not partners, or stakeholders, shareholders of the global order. And the idea there was that, you know, that there's no war yet between us and these rivals, but the rivals had, to use academic terms, they had sort of a hypothesis in their mind. Namely, they had a question whether the U.S. had staying power, whether the U.S. and its allies could maintain the map, the status quo of the map, of the global map. And therefore, starting in 2006, 2007, 2008, and so on and so forth, they start testing, or the way that we refer to this, they started to probe our American and Western stability and staying power in those frontline states and the frontiers. So 2008, obviously, we had a war between Russia and Georgia. 2014 was really a clear one, was the first round of the war between Russia and Ukraine. Obviously, 2020 is the second, much more aggressive round. And it seems very simple and and it is simple and commonsensical now, especially in retrospect, that argument. But at that time, it was somewhat of I guess you can make a career by saying simple things, because the prevailing view was that especially the front line of the frontier was not a place of competition, but it was a place where sort of the end of history and the gradual expansion and enlargement of sort of the more progressive view of history would have continued. So the expansion of democracy, and then obviously the institutional enlargement in various forms that followed with it. And you didn't have to compete with the enemies, because sooner or later these enemies would necessarily realize that this was the wave of the future. This was, as people often refer to it, this was to be on the right side of history. It was a line I think Obama used in one of his speeches. So, in the moment we start saying, that actually the frontier is unquiet because there is opposition from rivals, and there's actually pushback from rivals, and we have to prepare for it. Again, it seems it's a very simple argument, a very simple point, but at that time, it was seen as sort of pessimistic, overly negative, and so on and so forth. So, we decided again to look back and a little bit in retrospect and at where we are with this argument and with the geopolitical reality. And as you can imagine, our take is that, well, it's a much worse situation than 7-8 years ago. And it's no longer really an unquiet frontier, but in many cases, it's actually a frontier that is on fire, as we say, and that risk of tilting quite dramatically in the direction or in favor of our rivals. So the way we kind of looked at that, broke it down in the essay that I gave you, is just for just space reasons and simplicity, we try to think through 5 basic principles or rules of how to consider this frontier, this geopolitical frontier in Eurasia. And let me just go briefly in the next 10 minutes or so over these 5 rules. The first one is, again, very simple and commonsensical, but I think it's important to repeat it, especially in Washington, is that the frontier is unfortunately a violent space. War is always possible on that space because it is the line where the competition between rivals is happening. So it is not the place of sort of gradual expansion and enlargement of the zone of peace. It's actually the place where competition and, in many places, war is actually occurring. It's a line, a region that separates the different powers and the different types of orders established by the great powers in the respective areas, and therefore violence is always a possibility. And I'll again repeat here that really until 2020, especially here in DC, but actually in Europe too, this view was, I guess, controversial, to use that term. It was seen as something sort of retrograde, as if we came back from the 19th century, if not from the Roman Empire or something like that. That the view, for instance, if you went to Germany, that Russia actually was an aggressive power that was going to push westward, was certainly not an argument not well seen, and there's still issues with that, I think, in Germany in particular. But that's sort of a basic point, a principle of describing the type of dynamics that happen on the geopolitical front line or frontier between great powers. The second point, and sort of the kind of follow from each other, is that especially for global maritime power like the US, the best approach, the best strategy is to have very well armed frontier or frontline states and allies. A variety of reasons and sort of different arguments behind this argument, but this principle. But the main one is that the frontline states, take Israel, take Taiwan, take Poland, take even Ukraine, not an ally, but somewhat of a friend and a partner. They have an interest in maintaining the status quo, the geopolitical status quo. They have an interest in maintaining the stability of the frontier. And that interest aligns quite well with the interest of the distant power, of the distant global maritime power, that is, in this particular case, of the US. So they have a strong incentive to ensure their survival. Collapse of the frontier would actually really undermine, if not destroy, their sovereignty and their independence. And therefore, we have to accept that and work with that incentive. It's in our favor. One way to do it is truly encourage them and help them. And, there are actually operational problems, especially bureaucratic problems in the US, and help them to arm themselves. we can sort of go into the details of what that means and what the problems of that may be, whether bureaucratic or actually in some of the risks that we have to incur. But the broad view is that the frontier, the stability of the frontier is not going to be increased with disarmed frontline states. The goal is not the reduction of tension by disarmament. The goal is actually to increase the risks in the region by arming, including with offensive capabilities, these frontline states. And so that's part of a smaller debate here. Just a footnote, it's still ongoing, really, about what to do and how to arm Ukraine. But I think that's part of a larger debate on what to do with frontline states. The third principle, which is again related, is the argument that preclusive defense is really the best, if not really the only strategy that we should adopt on the frontier. The frontier is not and should not be seen as a flexible line, a place where you can actually engage in defense in depth, that you can allow the rival to penetrate deeply and then you can push them back. Multiple reasons for that. There are operational military reasons, but there are also political reasons, namely that if the frontline state considers itself or sees itself as part of the defense in depth of a great power, the incentives to defend itself or to align itself with the great power are decreased, because they're seen as the space where a great power or allies are willing to trade in order to defend the region and themselves later on. So it's sort of it's the fruit that is going to be picked by the enemy for buying time and defending the wider order and the wider regional situation, stability. And just politically, I think that's unfeasible. Therefore, the only strategy that a global power like the U.S. should adopt is truly defend the line, defend the frontier, and not engage in arguments about, for instance, again, defense in depth is something that we can do, 100 days later or a year later. Fourth principle has to do with a never-ending argument about reputation. There are arguments out there, both in academic literature and in policy, that the reputation of a great power is tied to the region. So if you lose reputation in Asia, well, it only matters for Asia. If you lose some reputation, you do something stupid in Afghanistan, well, you lose reputation only for that region, for Central Asia or Afghanistan per se. Our view is different. It's the opposite. Is the reputation is not something that you can sort of contain neatly in regional bottles. Rather, reputation is something that you as a great power have, and the reputational loss in one area, in one region, affects how you're perceived in a different region. And so, to give the most immediate example, I think the way we withdrew, and in general, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and there were good reasons for doing that, by the way, but the way has been done, and in general, the speed of the withdrawal turned into abandonment, that affected our reputation. And to a certain degree, I think it seems to have certainly affected the calculus that, and particularly Moscow, seems to have made about our ability and willingness to back allies and friends and partners. So it's something that, again, reputation is not contained or limited neatly to one particular area, geographic area, or a region. It's reputation lost or acquired on one area, one frontier, matters on another one. And I would add one more point to this, is that it really pays off to stop aggression or an aggressive posture of a rival at the frontier, no matter where it is, early on where it happens. Because especially now, I think the risk is that our inability and unwillingness to really address a breach or an assault on the frontier in one space, one region, the risk is that the other regions will collapse very quickly too, or at least, phrase it, the rivals in the other regions, the rivals in the other frontiers will have the enhanced temptation to strike and to try to breach the frontier in their respective zones, in their respective regions. So, a defeat in Ukraine, however we want to define it, will certainly tempt, I think, China and Beijing to do something much more aggressive in their region in the Pacific and Asia. So again, reputation is not self-contained into a particular region. It's something that's global. Lastly, the final point is, again, it's kind of related to the previous one, is that especially now with the technologies that have been developed over the past decades, once a frontier has been breached, it becomes exceedingly costly to regain it. Simply because, in general, maintaining the status quo seems to be cheaper, and maybe not easier, but definitely cheaper than breaking a status quo. But once the status quo has been broken in some form or fashion, the territory has been conquered, then now you have to repel or expel the rival from newly acquired territory, which, as we can see in the case of Ukraine in particular, is insanely costly, and it will have political consequences, in particular for the U.S., which I think are quite negative. Namely, there will be no political will to push back a rival from territories that they have managed to gain if they breach a frontier, whether it's, again, in Asia, whether it's certainly in the Middle East, if Iran does something really much more aggressive, and certainly Russia, if it goes for much more in a much more aggressive fashion westward. So it is cheaper, in other words, to maintain the frontier now than to try to restore it later once it's broken. And there is a political calculus too. Again, it goes back to the principle of preclusive defense. Once you have lost a frontier and the local allies are on the other side of the fence, they'll make different calculations. They will not necessarily be that happy to actually try to restore the status quo ante. If Ukraine falls under Russian sphere of influence or the Russian sway, I think it's highly unlikely that we will be able to reverse this frankly, in our lifetime, if not longer, because it requires a cost and an expenditure of our treasure and blood that I think we're not willing to do, and certainly that the Ukrainians will not be willing to do. And I think that's the same case for, if you want to extend it, to some NATO allies. So the point here, again, is that these are sort of very simple, related 5 rules or 5 principles on how to think about frontier and issues related to this. I'll just end on the point that there are some differences in the situation now from when we actually wrote a book in 2017, 2016, actually. Well, one is that the rivals, in particular Russia, is much more aggressive militarily, and it's set up its whole state and society towards war. That was something that did not happen yet in 2014. It certainly did not happen in 2016 or 17. Now it's different. This is a state that is clearly motivated and organized fully for a long-term, not just rivalry competition, but actually war, physical kinetic war with the West. That's obviously worrisome. Similarly, I think, especially in the past couple of years, it is clear that China, no matter how we calculate the numbers, has certainly developed capabilities and continues to develop capabilities that are not meant to just compete in free trade or technological development. It's meant to actually fight a physical kinetic war with the objective of expelling the U.S. from part of the Pacific. This was not as crystal clear 7-8 years ago. Now I think it's pretty clear from just the sheer amount of weapons and platforms that they're the types of weapons and platforms that they're developing. So here, there's a difference in the sort of the rivals and their much more assertive violent nature that, again, that was not as present or as visible 7-8 years ago. The second difference has to do, I think, in particular with the U.S. In the article, we mentioned actually the problem of the American southern border. And this is beyond sort of the partisan debates, which are quite acrimonious in D.C. about it. But the main point is, no matter what one thinks about immigration, in fact, illegal immigration and the numbers of it, it is creating an enormous political challenge that is, at best, just a distraction from everything, from foreign policy. But at worst, it's materially damaging American foreign policy abroad. The numbers of the illegal immigrants are quite astounding. They're in the millions now that come every year. This becomes sort of a frontier, so to speak. It's quite a border, a national border, but it becomes a frontier that we didn't really think in 2017 that would be as broken as it is now. It will have and will continue to have consequences, not just for domestic political partisan reasons and societal strife and in some cases instability, but in terms of U.S. foreign policy. There will be continued calls to give up, actually, a lot of geopolitical frontiers in many ways abroad because the national border takes precedence. Now, we can say that, okay, maybe that's not true in reality, that the frontiers in Eurasia are equally important or more important. The reality is that for a lot of people, this is not. National border takes absolute precedence, and not fixing it, and we can now debate, obviously, domestically what it means, will have consequences on the ability of the U.S. to actually maintain a posture abroad that is conducive to the stability of the frontier. And I mentioned this because usually, and even when we were pushing, putting the article up, there was pushback on this. That this is something that is about domestic politics and not about foreign policy, and it's partisan. And we're not trying to be partisan. We're just trying to sort of state a simple fact of the politics related to the situation on the border and its impact on foreign policy. It has, and again, I think will continue to have an enormous influence on how we perceive what to do in Ukraine, and that's a specific sort of argument right now, but I think it's much broader. It'll be about Taiwan, it'll be about the Middle East, it'll be about Europe in general, and how we invest in those frontiers, geopolitical frontiers, versus the national border that we have. So I'll end on that. I mean, obviously, as an academic and a book writer, as you all know, we can talk for hours, but I think the conversation and the questions may be more interesting than a lengthy lecture for me. So I'll end it on this, Len, and open up to questions.